You see a cafe from the outside, and it looks almost too easy. A storefront with warm lighting, plants in the window, a beautiful espresso machine behind the counter, somebody working on a laptop in the corner, a barista who knows 3 customers by name. You think, I could do this, and maybe you could. But here's the part nobody tells you. A cafe can sell a $6 drink that costs only a fraction of that to make, and still leave the owner with surprisingly little money at the end of the month. Because you are not really buying a coffee business. You are buying a lease, a build-out, a payroll system, an inventory system, a piece of real estate, a customer experience machine, and a very expensive habit of opening the doors every morning. The coffee is just what gets people to pay you. Let's start with the first check you have to write: opening a cafe. There is no honest universal number, because the cost depends enormously on the building you inherit, the city you're in, the size of the space, and how much construction it needs. But current industry estimates put a single coffee shop with seating roughly in the $80,000 to $300,000 range, with some projects going substantially higher when they involve major construction or expensive real estate. Toast's current industry guide gives that $80,000 to $300,000 range for a single coffee shop with seating, and notes that new construction can push costs much higher. And that range is enormous for a reason. Imagine you find a 1,200 square foot storefront. It looks perfect. Big windows, great neighborhood, nice sidewalk. Then the contractor walks in. The electrical service isn't sufficient for your equipment. The plumbing isn't where you need it. The drains aren't configured for the operation. The restroom needs work. The walls need opening. The counter needs to be built. And suddenly, your beautiful empty room isn't a cafe. It's a construction project. This is why the smartest real estate decision you can make may be choosing a space that was already a restaurant or cafe. You are not just renting square footage. You're renting the infrastructure somebody else already paid to build. And that can be worth a fortune. The U.S. Small Business Administration explicitly recommends separating startup expenses from ongoing monthly expenses and accounting for things such as space, equipment, utilities, licenses, insurance, inventory, employee salaries, legal and accounting costs, and marketing. That's important because first-time owners tend to think about the sexy expenses: the espresso machine, the furniture, the logo, the sign. They forget the boring expenses: permits, insurance, payroll before opening, training, deposits, initial inventory, utilities during construction, professional fees, and most importantly, cash to survive after opening. Toast recommends planning startup capital around the opening costs, plus roughly 3 to 6 months of operating expenses and an emergency reserve. Because opening day is not the finish line. It's the day the bills start. Now let's talk about the most expensive thing in the entire business. No, it's not the espresso machine. It's the location. A cafe lives or dies on how many potential customers can realistically reach it. A beautiful cafe hidden behind 3 buildings may have better rent. But if nobody sees it, your marketing department becomes your landlord. Every customer you need to convince to drive across town is a customer you're acquiring the hard way. Meanwhile, a visible storefront beside offices, apartments, transit, schools, or other businesses can generate demand simply because people are already there. But there is a trap. Foot traffic is not revenue. A sidewalk can be packed with people who never buy coffee. The real question is not, how many people walk past. It's how many of those people can I realistically convert into transactions, and what will they spend? That is the number you should build your lease around. Restaurant occupancy costs averaged about 5.2% of sales for limited service restaurants in 2024, according to the National Restaurant Association's 2025 operations data. Urban limited service restaurants were at about 6%. That doesn't mean every cafe must hit exactly 6%. It means you should stop thinking about rent as an isolated number. A $4,000 monthly lease sounds cheap until you discover your store only generates $40,000 a month. Now rent alone is consuming 10% of sales. A $7,000 lease can actually be healthier if the location reliably generates $150,000 a month. The expensive location isn't necessarily expensive. The unproductive location is expensive. Now you have the building. You need the machine. A serious commercial espresso setup isn't a giant home appliance. Toast lists examples of commercial machines ranging from several $1,000s to more than $20,000, with high-end restaurant equipment potentially taking a substantial portion of the startup budget. Then, come grinders, brewing equipment, refrigeration, ice, dishwashing, water filtration, POS hardware, shelving, smallwares, cups, pitchers, scales, storage, and all the tiny things nobody puts on the Instagram post. A cafe can look simple because the customer sees only the front 30% of the operation. The remaining 70% is where the business lives. Now here's where the economics become interesting. Suppose your average customer spends $6. That sounds great, but you don't get to keep $6. Some of that money immediately disappears into ingredients: coffee, milk, syrup, cups, lids, food, packaging. The National Restaurant Association reported that food and non-alcohol beverage costs for limited service restaurants had a median of 32.4% of sales in 2024. Then comes labor. And this is where many cafe fantasies collide with reality. You need somebody behind the machine. Somebody has to open the store. Someone has to prepare the bar. Someone has to take orders. Someone has to clean. Someone has to restock. Someone has to close. And you need enough people during the morning rush that customers aren't standing in line for 10 minutes. The National Restaurant Association found that salaries and wages, including benefits, represented a median 31.7% of sales for limited service restaurants in 2024. Among limited service operators that reported a pre-tax profit, the median was about 30%. Among operators reporting a loss, it was about 34.1%. That 3 or 4 percentage point difference sounds tiny. It isn't. On $500,000 of annual sales, 4 percentage points is $20,000. That's the difference between a business that feels healthy and one that feels permanently broke. And wages vary dramatically by market. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reported an average hourly wage of $17.18 for food and beverage serving workers in its May 2025 national occupational data. But local labor markets can be dramatically different. Seattle, for example, had a city minimum wage of $20.76 an hour in 2025 and $21.30 in 2026. So the same cafe model can have completely different economics depending on where the front door is located. This is why a cafe isn't just a coffee concept. It's a labor model attached to real estate. And labor has another problem. Demand isn't constant. At 7:30 in the morning, you might have a line. At 2:30, you might have 4 customers. If you schedule the same number of employees for both periods, you're paying people to stand around during the exact hours when your revenue is weakest. The POS system is therefore not just a cash register. It is a forecasting tool. You want to know when customers arrive, what they buy, how much they spend, how long the rush lasts, and when demand collapses. Then you schedule accordingly, because a barista working during a rush can generate hundreds of dollars in sales. A barista working through a dead afternoon may generate almost nothing. Now let's talk about the thing that can dramatically improve the economics of every customer who walks through your door: food. A customer who buys a $5.50 latte has created one transaction. A customer who buys a $5.50 latte and a $5 pastry has created a $10.50 transaction. You didn't have to rent another building. You didn't have to acquire another customer. You already paid the cost of getting that person through the door. The second item is where the economics can become powerful. But food comes with a nasty enemy: waste. Milk expires. Pastries become stale. Sandwiches have shelf lives. Ingredients get overportioned. Products get damaged. And everything you throw away is inventory you purchased with real cash. So the best cafe operators don't simply ask, "What food should we sell?" They ask, "What food can we sell consistently enough that the waste doesn't destroy the margin?" That's a completely different question. Now we get to the strangest part of the cafe business. The customer isn't only buying the drink. They're buying the room. Maybe they're paying $6 for a latte. But what they really want is a comfortable chair, reliable Wi-Fi, air conditioning, music at the right volume, a clean restroom, good lighting, and a place where they can sit without feeling like they're in their own house. The cafe becomes a temporary piece of real estate they rent by the hour. And that creates a fascinating problem. Imagine somebody buys one $6 coffee at 9 a.m. and occupies a 4-person table until 2 p.m. From the customer's perspective, that's an amazing deal. From the owner's perspective, it can be terrible, because that table has limited capacity. If 4 customers could have used it during multiple transaction cycles, the opportunity cost of one long stay becomes significant. This doesn't mean you should kick laptop workers out. It means you need to design the room deliberately. Communal tables, counter seating, 2-person tables, power outlets, different seating zones, fast service areas, long stay areas, maybe even outdoor seating. You're not decorating a room. You're designing revenue-producing square footage. And there is another hidden cost. The law. A cafe open to the public has accessibility obligations under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and restaurant requirements can include accessible dining surfaces and accessible portions of service counters. That means the space has to work not only aesthetically, but legally. Then there are permits, insurance, accounting, software, payment processing, cleaning, waste disposal, repairs, maintenance, marketing, internet, utilities. And utilities aren't theoretical. Toast estimates utilities for restaurants under 4,000 square feet at roughly $1,000 to $1,200 per month, though actual costs vary significantly with location, equipment, operating hours, and building conditions. Add all of those costs together, and you discover something uncomfortable. A cafe can have a very high gross margin on an individual drink, while still having a very modest net margin at the business level. The National Restaurant Association reported median income before taxes of just 4.0% of sales for limited service restaurants in 2024. 4%. On $500,000 in sales, that's $20,000. And that's before you start telling yourself that your cafe is somehow going to magically produce a 20% net margin. Could an individual cafe do better? Absolutely. But you shouldn't build a business plan around being an exceptional outlier. Build it around surviving the ordinary case. Now imagine a cafe doing $500,000 in annual sales. That's roughly $41,700 a month. Sounds substantial. But imagine around 32% going toward food and beverage costs. Another roughly 30% or more toward labor. Then occupancy, utilities, payment processing, insurance, software, maintenance, marketing, repairs, waste, taxes. Suddenly, the $500,000 headline number looks very different. And this is why revenue is one of the most misunderstood numbers in business. Revenue is not what you make. Revenue is what passes through your hands before everyone else takes their share. The owner gets what's left. And sometimes what's left is surprisingly small. That's also why owner labor matters. If you personally work 6 days a week, open at 5:30 a.m., manage employees, order inventory, handle repairs, solve customer problems, and close the store at night, you may be generating an income. But you may not actually own a passive asset. You own a job with equipment. That's not necessarily bad. A well-run cafe can provide a good living. But you need to understand what you're buying. Because there are really two different businesses hiding inside the word cafe. The first is one location that supports its owner. The second is a repeatable coffee brand that can operate without the founder standing behind the machine. Those are completely different economic models. The first location teaches you the system. The second location tests whether the system actually works. Can the same menu work somewhere else? Can another manager run the store? Can the brand travel? Can you buy ingredients efficiently across multiple locations? Can your training system produce consistent drinks without you? Can headquarters handle accounting, marketing, hiring, purchasing, and technology for several stores? That's when the economics start changing. Because some costs are fixed. One accountant can support multiple stores. One brand can support multiple stores. One website can support multiple stores. One purchasing system can support multiple stores. One management structure can support multiple stores. Revenue can grow faster than overhead. That's the beginning of scale. And then there is another possible layer. Roasting. A cafe that buys roasted coffee from a supplier is purchasing a finished product. A coffee company that roasts its own beans can potentially create another business around wholesale. Now, the company isn't only selling cups to people who walk through its doors. It's selling bags to other cafes, offices, hotels, restaurants, online customers. The cafe becomes the showroom. The roasting operation becomes the production engine. That's a much bigger business. Blue Bottle is an interesting example of this progression. Founded in Oakland in 2002, it grew from a small specialty coffee operation into an international brand. Nestlé acquired a majority stake in 2017 at a valuation reported at roughly $700 million. The lesson isn't that every cafe becomes Blue Bottle. It doesn't. The lesson is that the valuable asset eventually stops being the espresso machine. It becomes the brand, the customer relationship, the operating system, the supply chain, and the ability to reproduce the experience. That is the real economics of owning a cafe. You start with coffee. Then you discover you're actually managing labor. Then you discover you're managing real estate. Then inventory. Then customer psychology. Then brand. And if you're ambitious enough, eventually you're managing a system that can operate without you. That's when the business stops being simply a place where people buy coffee. It becomes an asset, because the cafe owner who spends every morning making perfect cappuccinos has built a job. The owner who builds a location that works without them has built a business. And the owner who can reproduce that location 5, 10, or 50 times has built a company. So if you're dreaming about opening a cafe, don't start with the espresso machine. Start with the spreadsheet. How many customers do you need every day? What's your average ticket? What percentage of sales goes to food and beverage? How many labor hours do you need? What happens if sales are 20% below your forecast? How many months of cash can you survive? What happens if the machine breaks? What happens if your best barista quits? What happens if construction costs 30% more than expected? And most importantly, can this business still survive when reality is worse than the dream? Because the cafe business isn't difficult because coffee is complicated. It's difficult because the margins are thin, the fixed costs are real, the customers are unpredictable, and every small mistake gets multiplied by thousands of transactions. The beautiful storefront is what customers see. The spreadsheet is what the owner lives inside. And the people who build great cafes understand one simple truth. You're not selling coffee. You're monetizing a location, a routine, a room, a relationship, and a brand. One $6 transaction at a time. And if you can make that system profitable without depending on you personally being behind the counter every morning, then you don't just own a cafe. You own a business.